Alright, welcome to the patch 11.1 ranged Mistweaver guide. Now this video is for people who already know how the class works and already know how the talents works and all the spell interactions and just want to know about the build. If you want the beginner guide, it will be out in exactly 2 days after this video. It's already done. I just wanted to get some initial feedback from this one to use to improve it if needed, because I feel like the beginner guide needs to be much more, meticulously planned and thought out. Now, disclaimer, as I always do with this build, range Mistweaver means that you are able to do all of your HPS, every last drop of it, without having to go into melee. It does not mean you don't play in melee. Your utility, most of your damage, and just your entire class functions better being in melee. Reason for a ranged Mistweaver build is just to have a different playstyle for people who may not enjoy fist weaving as much, and also a very, very, very high HPS playstyle that is conducive to the tank positioning poorly, the boss being in random bad stuff that you can't stand in, or maybe sometimes when you have packs or the mobs are spread out. The idea is that this is just an alternative build. This build is not intended for you to push 0.1% title, and it's definitely not intended to be like world first keys. But in my opinion, if you're not pushing world first keys or you're not pushing 0.1% title, which is literally 99.9% of people, it doesn't make sense building your character as if you are going to do that. Now, all the footage for this guy was made in the first 2.5 days of the season. This was before the dungeons were nerfed and without pretty much any gear in this season. So just keep that in mind. If you're looking at this 3 or 4 months into the season wondering why we're doing struggled bust DPS on a 9, it's because this is a 9 on day 2. Now, as you can see, this build does not trade off pretty much anything at all. The only thing I would say that fist weaving has categorically better than this range playstyle is fist weaving is much more consistent because your HPS is very consistent because you're only using like 3 spells to fist weave. And also fist weaving is much, much, much better for scheduling cooldowns in super high end groups. And that's why I think fist weaving is still going to be categorically better at the ultra high end. And in almost every other situation, I think that the range build is more flexible, has greater skill expression, has considerably higher peak HPS, and for the most part, on paper, you're supposed to lose like 10 to 15% DPS with this build. However, in practice, playing fist weaving versus playing this range build versus comparing myself to other good fist weavers, I don't really see the damage loss in actual dungeons, but just know it's supposed to do less DPS. It just isn't really doing less DPS. As you can see on Zav here, a boss that requires very minimal HPS, it's still doing like 800k single and 2 target, which is more than enough. It's good to see that this build doesn't compromise on the necessary DPS for bosses like this. And similarly, of course, it being a range build that's focused more on HPS, when you get to double pulls like this was the first 10 I had ever attempted for the season, I think. It's pumping 3 mil HPS and it can do this forever. You basically don't use much mana. Now, mana was nerfed, or mana T rather, was nerfed coming into the season. It's 15% less mana regen. All that really means is that the first 3 or 4 pulls of every single dungeon, you're going to want to stop and drink after the pulls instead of mana T'ing. That way you just get your mana T stacks up to 20 or close to 20. And then for the rest of the dungeon, you can mana T as you need, and you probably don't really need to drink unless you have a super extended pull or you have mini bosses like this that require over 3 million HPS for an extended period of time, especially if the DPS isn't as great. All right, this is how the build looks in its base form. There are some flexibilities, and also I'm not going to talk about the class tree. The Mistweaver class tree is super diverse, and there's a ton of talents that could be completely up to what you want to use and what you need for specific dungeons or specific comps, or even just personal preference. For example, I don't use Chi Burst. Chi Burst is a super efficient ability in that it doesn't use any mana at all and it deals free damage and healing. However, I just think that the global is a waste of time and I could do more damage and more healing because resource isn't an issue for this build. If you want to use Chi Burst, you can use Chi Burst. The only thing that I think is truly optional is summon Jade Serpent. A lot of the margins, especially for the tank hits and the higher end DPS hits in these dungeons, a lot of the margins are very, very tight, and an extra free like 800k to a million healing from a Soothing Mist is pretty decent and can be the game changer in certain situations. Now, hero talents, let's talk about this really quickly. This is entirely unchanged from last season. The only difference is that this Heart of the Jade Serpent node functionally does the same thing. It's just that it procs a different way now. In 11.0, it was kind of stupid and it was proccing for free without doing anything. Now it requires Shaylun. However, Shaylun was moved from right here to just above it, so it's in this middle third of the tree now, meaning we don't have to commit a bottom third point to get Shaylun anymore, so this build will in fact take Shaylun. And the additional flex point here in the hero talent that you can change, this is whether you want Fortifying Bruise, Absorb Shield, or you want DR in Conduit. I've gone back and forth on these. If I'm comfortable with the dungeon, I'll go with the Fort Bruise Shield, but if I'm uncertain about what's going to happen in the dungeon, or the comp is too different, or I think it might be super spontaneous, I will go with the 10% or 50% DR during Conduit. Conduit was buffed a lot and the healing is unchanged. However, it does a considerable amount of DPS now. It's almost a million per tick. In this patch, you can elect to use conduit, especially on single target, for quite a lot of damage. Now, before we go on to gameplay, let's just talk about the class tree a little bit more. There are some flex points you can take. So firstly, with Shaylun, whether you want to run Veil of Pride to get a faster Shaylun, or you want to run Xiaohao Lessons to get Shaylun as a buffing window, is totally up to you. I've found that Veil of Pride generally gets more effective healing in terms of healing that will actually save people because of hits coming up. However, I think later on in the patch, I might go to Xiaohao's Lessons. I'm not too sure yet, but this is try both of these and see what you like. Also, this is the default configuration. However, now there are some changes I'd recommend depending on the situation. So firstly, this Chi Cocoon setup where Chi Cocoon is 1.3 minute cooldown because of this node and it applies HOTS is good for healing DPS or healing yourself. This shield is going to be meaningless healing a tank. It's 4 million almost, and that's like one tank white melee. If you think you need to heal your tank, you take out of the fast cooldown reduction node and you put it in the increase absorb node. That'll buff it to like a 6 or 7 million absorb, which is way more significant. Now, if you think you want to build totally for yourself, I would even take out Mists of Life, put it into Healing Elixir so you get auto heals on yourself. I'd take a point from this choice node and put it on the right one so you get Mana Tea stacks. Energizing Brew is what you would run if you're using Mana Tea for the post effect. So basically, Mana Tea is two components you probably know. The channel gives you mana back, and then after the channel, depending on how long you spent channeling, it gives you 30% mana reduction. Energizing Brew lets you get much better usage of the post effect because the channel is so quick, you quickly consume stacks, and then you can spend a lot of time with a 30% mana reduction. If you actually think you're going to run out of mana and the free 5 stacks every single time you cocoon is not enough, you can run life cycles. Just note that this will considerably slow down your Mana Tea consumption, so you have to plan to get like a really big life cycles Mana Tea out before you go into your big healing window. And another big change I made this season is I removed Invoker's Delight, the 20% haste when we activate Yu'lon. Our stats are getting pretty high now, and I just don't feel like I need that 20% haste. However, I am running Signet of the Priory. Now at 32% base haste, if I activate Yu'lon and Signet at the same time, I go up to 41. And then if I Thunder Focus Tea and Renewing Mist myself, I go up to 62%. So that's an additional 30% for a little bit here. That's way more than enough. I think it's nice to run a 2-minute trinket and macro it to Yu'lon, which basically frees up a talent point. Now, I don't think you even need this if you don't have an unused trinket personally. It's just so that people coming from the last patch that had this haste in Yu'lon, if you're missing it with this build, I would strongly recommend farming one of the 2 unused trinkets or just anything that gives you haste. Or even if you're comfortable with 30% haste, then that's fine because you can always Thunder Focus Tea to give yourself up to 50% haste. And again, that's like tons. That's way more than you probably need. Now, the stats for this build before we go on to gameplay is haste first. I like haste to 30%. More the merrier for me personally, just because the class feels faster and more snappy with more haste. Don't go into the DR too much, but 30% haste after you have Weapon Oil and Flask on is totally fine. Now, I'm running Verse Flask because I was trying to attempt a hierarchy, and that's pretty much how the second secondary stat's gonna go. If you just want throughput, go crit after haste. If you think you need to live and you're dying and getting one shot in keys, you have to build some Verse. But realistically, the only stat I think that matters is about 30% haste after consumables. Incidentally, I have too much mastery, but that's just an early gearing symptom that'll even itself out. Mastery is again not good just because mastery is only healing. It's good for healing, but you ideally want your stats to contribute both to healing and DPS. Now, when looking at gameplay, just so you know what's on my UI, my frames are in the center here. They're going to grow horizontally. And above my damage meters shows the history of my spells. And you can see the channels and casts and stuff like that have their own little radial thing. Just so you know what to look at when we're going into gameplay examples now. Now, the goal of this build is to keep Renewing Mist as up as possible on as many targets as possible so that you have the option to Vivify Cleave Heal should you run out of cooldowns. But the real strength of this build comes with the amount of cooldowns you have. You have 2-minute Yu'lon, you have Conduit that does a ton now, and you have Shaylun to top people up. Now, these cooldowns are individually so strong. When you're rotating through your cooldowns, you're very much mana neutral, and you don't really want to stack your cooldowns unless you know for sure you won't need them before they come back up. Now, in Yu'lon was recently buffed. So this node here, Jade Bond, now makes it so that when the Chi Cocoons from Yu'lon fall off, they apply Enveloping Mist, which is super huge for you. As well as Yu'lon is now fixed 2 minutes from last patch. For some reason, they doubled the absorb of the initial Yu'lon Chi Cocoon. This was not necessary, but it basically means that whenever you Yu'lon, you put a 2 mil shield on everyone in the party, which is a ton. Now, Yu'lon did not need this at all, but I mean, we'll take it. This means that this season, Yu'lon is now an actual throughput cooldown, when last season it was more so just to give you 50% off Enveloping Mist. Now, when you're in Yu'lon, as you see, I enter a Soothing Mist channel here, and I start applying Enveloping Mist to the entire party. This ensures that everyone gets Renewing Mists refreshed, giving them their Chi Harmony 50% increased healing from Renewing Mist, because Renewing Mist autocasts whenever you Enveloping Mist. And also you can see here the Mending Proliferation buff, which means Enveloping Mist's healing amp is being doubled on some targets and spread to the entire party, effectively giving the entire party moments of 140% increased healing, or more commonly like 80 to 90% increased healing. Now, usually with the initial Chi Cocoons from Yulon and applying these Enveloping Mists through Soothing Mists, but Enveloping Mists and Yulon's passive healing and shielding will keep people topped up, but it won't move a health bar from like 30% to 100% if you're taking heavy damage. You need to fill in with Vivify to top people up. Now remember, the only time you ever Enveloping Mist with this build is going to be through Soothing Mist or Strength of the Black Ox. You never hard cast Enveloping Mist, it just takes too long. Now you can Thunder Focus Tea and Enveloping Mist. Now this is sort of like a mistake, honestly, because you want to Thunder Focus Tea and Renewing Mist because our tier set now no longer extends our HOTS. So the free 3-second extensions we were getting last season we don't have, which means it's going to be a little harder to maintain Renewing Mists. So we really want Renewing Mist from Thunder Focus Tea to give us that increased duration and to give us a lot of haste. But that being said, again, if it's an emergency and you Thunder Focus Tea and someone takes a ton of damage, you don't want to Vivify with Thunder Focus Tea because all it does is it makes it cost no mana and gives you mastery, which is really bad. But if you Enveloping Mist, you get at least crit and it applies it instantly, and it also heals them for a pretty decent chunk. Now looking at a more dangerous pull here, this pull will require about 3 million HPS in Priory on a 10 just after the nurse. Now I start off with Yulon, get Soothing Mist on the entire party. I'm still weaving in damaging abilities, and I'm also making sure to Rushing Wind Kick on cooldown. Rushing Wind Kick is not only a ton of damage, but it's extending all of your HOTS, and that's extremely important. So this is probably the most important rotational ability you have is Wind Kick. And then after I Rushing Wind Kick, the next priority in my DPS is to spend my Crackling Jade Lightning Empowered from the Thunder Focus Tea. And you can see this is pretty much the floor of your DPS. I am only 100% focusing on HPS, and I'm doing about 300k DPS. It shouldn't really ever get less than this. You can see I even go to 400k here, or almost at the end of the pull. This is as bad as it gets. This is as low as the DPS will get. Now, as you near the end of the Yulon window, you will have to fill in gaps in healing. Conduit, as you can see, does a ton of damage in healing now, so that's a really good way to fill in. And then if you need just a single burst of healing, Shayloon's Gift at pretty much 6 or more stacks will generally top the party from half health. And you can see even here, I run out of cooldowns because I misjudged when this pack was going to end, and I've used too many cooldowns too early because I just thought this pack would already be dead right now at this point. But because I have so many seconds of Renewing Mist ready, and I have an Enveloping Mist off spreading this Mending Proliferation healing increase, I can now go into an almost exclusive Vivify spam rotation that's bolstered by our healing increases, and that'll be pretty much enough to maintain 3 mil HPS, because one of the nice things about this build is in situations like these, you could just start pumping through Vivifies, or if I had a little bit more time, like if one of these tanks died quicker, which is what you're supposed to do on this pack instead of killing them evenly, I would enter a Soothing Mist channel and then Enveloping Mist and burn a ton of mana to get a whole bunch of healing increases and a whole bunch of big HOTS on the party. Remembering to Wind Kick always, though, even under high pressure, you still need to Wind Kick on cooldown. And it's totally okay if in some situations you can't hit the boss with Wind Kick. It's important to get Wind Kick out regardless if it can deal damage or not. Even if it literally dealt no damage, would still be good to use because it's extending all your HOTS and giving a little burst of healing as well. Now remember, even though this build is not taking Ancient Teachings, the like underpowered Ancient Teachings means that you heal for 30% of the damage you deal baseline. And if I just go take a random key I just did here, you can see all of your damage, 70% plus of my damage are just 2 spells, meaning 30% of each of their damage turns into healing. So if I look at my healing done for a key, Ancient Teachings is actually quite a lot. Now, most of that, or almost all of that, is on the tank, because the tank is going to be the one that takes this smart healing. However, even though, again, you don't have Ancient Teachings, just because of how hard the few damaging spells you have on this kit hits, it means that you will still do a lot of passive healing just from dealing damage. Now, after I use these 2 spells, if I'm doing damage, the first thing I'll do is Wind Kick. If I want to Wind Kick, but it's not on cooldown, you Blackout Kick to try to reset it. And if you want to Blackout Kick, but Blackout Kick's not ready, then you Tiger Palm to get a stack of Blackout Kick, and then you just keep going like that. Now, a lot of the times, you will not be able to enter melee, and you'll be about this distance from a boss. Maybe it's a little bit too dangerous, too crowded, or you're in a full melee group, at which point this build shines quite well, because Wind Kick can still hit from range, and Chi Lightning can still hit from, obviously, up to 40 yards. But also, if you can't sneak in melee and Wind Kick's on cooldown and you don't have Chi Lightning, spinning Spinning Crane Kick actually hits at like just over this circle. You can see the circle looks very small, but it is hitting at almost double the radius of the circle. Spinning Crane Kick has a bonus effect in that it can proc and give you mana T stacks. So a lot of the times in dungeons, you will see me mindlessly spamming Spinning Crane Kick sometimes, even when I have Blackout Kick, or maybe even if I have a Rushing Wind Kick up. That's usually because I'm trying to farm up some mana T stacks, or I just can't quite get close enough to the mobs, and Spinning Crane Kick is safer and it reaches. Now, so the last time I posted this build, there was some fair criticisms, but I think I wanted to address them. Firstly, the most common thing people said was that if you're playing a ranged build for Mistweaver, it doesn't make sense because you can't bait range mechanics. Keep in mind, it's called the range build. I call it the range build. You're not actually in range. It's just that you don't need to be in melee. So if you need to be next to the mobs to bait mechanics that's targeting the entire group that you don't want to bait away, you can just do that. Like, I don't see how the build not requiring you to be in melee affects anything at all about baiting mechanics or range targeting mechanics. I just didn't understand that, to be honest. But it also does mean that if you have to bait something, like for example on the last boss of Priory, if I have to bait the beam, I can do that as this build, and I don't really lose much at all. I can still heal, I can still get my hots out, I can still do everything. I can spend my Vivifies, cast instant enveloping mist with Thunder Focus Tea. That I just don't understand how the build not mandating melee affects anything at all. Like, you can still be in melee if you want to, and you should, because all your utility is either 15-yard range or shorter, and your kick is a true melee kick. So you do end up going back into melee very, very frequently. But again, remember, it's called range because you can heal, and all of your healing is ranged, but you are not a ranged character. So just to create that distinction. And the other criticism I was seeing is that, oddly enough, people were saying that this isn't the way Monk is intended to be played. Like, it's not, the class designer didn't intend this. They put the talents in the game. I'm picking the talents. The class is made to play however you want. If it's fun and you enjoy the build, play it. It's not going to take you to like 19 key levels, but you're not going to 19 key levels. Let's be completely honest here, right? No one's going to 19 key levels. Again, I see, using the numbers from last season, it might change this season. If you're going for 0.1% title, use the meta build, sure. But if you're the other 99.9% of the people, use whatever build you want. If it's fun, play it. If it's not fun, don't play it. That's pretty much how all classes should be, but especially healing, because skill gap can make up for a terrible build in healing. And sometimes you see people running terrible builds and doing well, or people running the meta builds and not healing enough. It's just so much of a healer's build is how much you vibe with it, how much you are able to relate to the build and make good use of it, and how much the build is catering to your own playstyle and your own reflexes and just your own comfort. Now, and a nice rule of thumb I like to use to remember how to explain to people when you use what with this build is basically, if someone will ever need healing, press Renewing Mist. You basically press it on cooldown and prio pressing it on people who don't already have it. You also use Thunder Focus Tea to give you a longer Renewing Mist, but you'll use it before you have to heal to give you haste from Secret Infusion. And then basically, if someone will need healing soon, or maybe they're at 80% and you think they're going to take damage soon, then you enter Soothing Mist and you Enveloping Mist that person. If someone needs healing now, you Vivify. And that's basically the 3 rotational heals. If there's an extended period of healing coming up, you can reactively use Invoke Yulon, because it puts a 2 mil shield on everyone. And then your Yulon rotation is predominantly going to be entering Soothing Mist and Enveloping Misting the entire party, and then Vivifying people that drop beneath, like, let's say 60 or 70% HP if a big hit's coming. But that could be like someone who's under 90% HP if it's a much higher key and the hit's going to be way, way larger. And then if ever you fall behind or you want to use it for damage, Celestial Conduit does a ton of healing to a ton of allies, and make sure you double press it. So you press Conduit and then you press it again to activate this unity within to give you much bigger shields and activate all your Celestials. Now, important thing to remember is you can use all of your abilities that don't do damage or healing during Conduit, but basically your main utility. So if I'm in Conduit here, you can see I can leg sweep, I can put a ring down and it doesn't actually stop Conduit, and you see the end thing still goes off. And also remember that you can paralysis during Conduit, you can interrupt during Conduit, you can use your defensives. You just can't expel harm, you can't cocoon, you can't do any actual rotational abilities, but you can use almost all of your utility during Conduit. And you can even roll around and lighter than air double tap roll during Conduit as well. That's basically going to be it. Now, if you've ever played Mistweaver or have any experience and you just wanted this to be a build, this should have been enough for you. Again, if you don't know much about the class or are very new to the class, there may be a lot that you don't understand. Now, again, exactly 2 days after I upload this, I will upload the beginner version, and that will basically not spare any detail and tell you how every single spell works and how they all interact interact, and fundamentally how the class works. I just wanted to get this out first, maybe get some feedback, see if anything needed to be changed, and see just how I can explain this for people who already know the class. Because I think if I can't explain it to people who already know the class, I surely can't explain it to beginners. Yeah, that's gonna be all for now. Let me know if you guys like the build, if you have fun with it. I'm up to like 10 11s right now. I haven't really tried more than that. I just wanted to fill out Vault, but I'm trying to get to like 11s or 12s before the reset. And so far, it's not had any issues. Everyone that I've asked didn't notice I was running a different build, pugs and stuff, because they said the damage was about what they would expect from a Mistweaver this season. And the HPS, obviously, no one's losing HPS checks as I've been playing this build so far. And also, let me know if anyone wants or cares about a raid build. Now that the raid build by default is much more in range, there's not really a more ranged raid build, but this is the build I've been running. And now while my guild has only cleared 6 bosses in heroic so far, on the first kills of everything, and this is like not intending to parse, we're not healing with less healers on average, and we're not taking more damage on average. Yeah, actually, our execution parses have been pretty good. But as you can see, this raid build is simply just sweeping so far, it seems. In at least heroic, it's doing insanely well. And I honestly couldn't tell you what everyone else is doing such that this is that high percentages. But yeah, if anyone wants a raid build video, it'll be a lot shorter because it's way easier to play and it's very simple. But let me know. Be happy to do that. That's all for now, though. Later.